Hello, and welcome to Let's Talk About It. This is your host, Taylor Nolan, former reality TV personality and practicing psychotherapist, and welcome to episode 102, where we will be discussing very uncomfortable topics, but very necessary to discuss, including white fragility, which I've talked about many times on my Instagram page at Taymocha. And we'll be discussing it with David, who is a white male. So very fitting for this. As I've shared on Instagram, it's really important that white people are involved in this conversation, and that sometimes when messages around white fragility are given by people of color, that it can be really difficult for other white people to actually absorb these messages and hear them. So buckle up for what might be a very uncomfortable episode if you are a white person. But with that being said, welcome, and I'm happy to have you here. In addition to topics like white fragility today, we will also discuss the political climate both in the U.S. and in Canada, and how history has kind of helped shape privilege and the racism that we currently see in our society. I'm really excited about this episode. It was actually filmed or recorded in Toronto, so hence discussing Canadian and U.S. politics. And I'm really excited because this guest is very into politics, and he's going to be able to really explain some of this stuff to us. Knows a lot about history. So I'm really excited to, chat with him a little bit more and share with you guys a lot of his knowledge in this area. So with all of that said, let's talk about it. All right. So welcome, David, to the show. Thank you so much for coming in to chat with me today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a little bit of like a last minute kind of a thing. And I got to say, I love talking about mental health on the podcast and sexual health, but I think there's also a huge part of me that is super passionate about social justice type of things and talk just overall things that make us feel uncomfortable. And usually like politics is a huge one. And so I'm really excited to have you on here because I've shared you as a resource just for political things in general, as you do political news commentary, but also like specifically white fragility, because you did a video on white fragility that I really appreciated. And my family member, Rob, who I've talked about a lot on the podcast and has helped me through my whole racial identity journey as well. He's one that sent it to me and was like, "You did a really good job. Like, you should follow him."
That's great to hear.
Yeah. So I'm really excited to chat with you, and there's a few things I want to get into. But first, just the fact that we're in Canada, there's this whole stereotype, right, that Canadians are just so nice and they're so polite, and like racism doesn't exist in Canada.
There is, and even Canadians, we all think, I shouldn't say we all, but a lot of Canadians definitely think this, and I think it stems from the fact that we aren't really taught history properly. We have a history of blackface in this country, for example, just as America does. So when the whole Justin Trudeau, our prime minister, and it came out that he had put on blackface not once but multiple times. Yeah. And to have people sort of just brush it off. I mean, people in my own family that are older that just think, oh, it's just a kind of dress. He was just dressing up for Halloween. What's the big deal? And I understand the inclination to feel that way if you don't understand the history and the impact that has on people of color. Yeah. So when it comes to blackface, there's a history of blackface in America and the U.S. Where you had performers dressing up in blackface as a way to mock people of color, and not even just white people dressing up in blackface, but they forced black performers to put on blackface to hide their humanity. So when you understand that history and the impact that still has on people, and for a former prime minister or for a current prime minister to wear that, and not like it's one thing if you have the random Joe who doesn't understand the history, okay, whatever. Yeah. But you have a prime minister who is not only a prime minister, the son of a prime minister as well. Yeah. For him not to understand this, and then on top of that, to have other liberals defend him. Look, I am a very progressive person. It's going to become clear when we get more into politics.
We're going to talk about Bernie. Yeah. We're going to feel the burn, guys.
We'll get into Bernie Sanders. But this is there's this serious disconnect between liberals and conservatives. many liberals and when I say liberals, I mean people that support the liberal party and liberal politicians. They think, oh, Trudeau is very progressive. He's, he has a equal gender cabinet. He's very flowery language. Always speaks up for people that are, the downtrodden. But does he? In practice, who is he actually? And he has this this has been discussed ad nauseum in the past, but he has this public persona and a private persona. He is not somebody that is going to fight for the poor middle class to the detriment of those that are wealthy, for example. And this is where the Liberal Party really is a center-right party. So they are sort of liberal on social issues somewhat, but then very conservative when it comes to economic policy, much as the Conservative Party is. So it's a good thing in this country we have multiple parties. We have the NDP, which is a progressive party, does speak to progressive economic issues, does speak to labor reforms, and also, in addition to that, is also socially progressive. But we see that disconnect between race and liberals really became evident when that blackface thing,
with Trudeau.
When that whole thing blew up with Trudeau. And this shows Canadians in general, we really don't have a grasp on our history, and not even just our history, but our impact as people that are as a country that largely is looked at as a country that is kind and nice, and you come here, we're welcoming, and a lot of that is true, in somewhat, but we have this lack of awareness when it comes to race, and I really I go back to history. I think it's a lack of history. I think it's a lack of awareness where our media has been essentially, for the most part, consumed by white people. And just as America, people in positions of power are largely white, largely male. Yep. And that's going to trickle down to the hiring process. It's going to trickle down to how the media perceives issues. Yeah. And we really don't have that. I think now we're beginning to have more of a conversation about this kind of thing. But for a while, there's just been a total disconnect. And part of it is generational. As well. Yeah. As I said, older people are sort of they're less aware of these issues as opposed to people like me who are online all the time, always learning, always evolving. Yeah. And myself, I grew up in a white suburb. It's not lost on me that I was completely oblivious to all of this most of my life. Yeah. Until I grew up and began to really engage in political issues, began to pay a little more attention, and you learn and you grow. And I think also showing that process of growth is important. Yes. Because, and being able to explain it in that way as well. Because if you simply, there's this, so when we discuss white fragility, I think that term immediately turns off a lot of people. Yes. Me as a white person, I can say I'm not bothered by that because I understand what that means. But
at one point you didn't. And when you didn't.
And when I didn't, absolutely, hearing that would have been like, what are you talking about? I'm not, like, what are you possibly saying that because people think they have their own struggles, right? And they do. Everyone has, we all have our own struggles. But if you are somebody who is a person of color in this country, even though you may have similar struggles, or even though white people may have similar struggles to everyone else in terms of, finding the right career path, finding a job, there's an extra layer, an extra barrier there for people of color. Because when people of color go to job interviews, largely they are being interviewed by white people.
Yeah, by a white man.
Yeah, and often by white men, and there is this almost this familiarity kind of in the hiring process where you see this. It's evident in television and movies as well. When you have writers and producers and directors that are white, guess who shows up in the roles? Yeah. Other white people. Yep. And it's because that's their experience, right? So it boils down to requiring not just a cultural shift in understanding how there is this division between how white people think, even when they think they're being inclusive, that they actually aren't, because it also has to do with who's at the top of these companies, who's actually making the decisions, as opposed to, oh, look, we got our token person of color. There's a representation.
Yeah.
That doesn't serve. No, that
doesn't work.
No, it doesn't give people the experience. Like it doesn't share what the true experience of that person is. So that's where real stories or people that run companies that are people of color are able to actually bring that experience that wasn't there before to their work, whether it's in media, whether it's in movies, television, whether it's just in the business world. Yeah. So representation means a lot, and we're going to get into Bernie and politics as well, because people will think, hey, well, if you're so pro this, then why do you support an old white man as opposed to
Yes.
But there's also
AOC just had to answer that question, and I think it's it's a very valid question, and definitely something we'll get into. I'm curious to hear from you a little bit of how I know you said, you just started learning things online more, but I'm curious for you as, I guess, for the people that are just listening to this on audio as the podcast, as a white man, David, I'm introducing you as a white man now. And I hope that isn't offensive. Hope you don't think I'm being racist.
No, not at all.
Yeah, but I'm curious for you what that experience was like, maybe in college or wherever, where you did start to perhaps be more aware of the different life experiences and perspectives of people of color and how that plays a role overall in the entire system, whether in Canada or just the world in general. Yeah,
I guess the evolution really... I wouldn't even say it was through college, because funny enough, I went to college in a very white town, so it wasn't even really... much exposure there. It was more through media and television and beginning to understand. So, for example, the criminal justice system clearly disproportionately impacts people of color. And what really began to, I guess, sort of open my eyes is when I began to hear stories directly from people that experienced this. So, for example, there's a black man who discussed his experience as somebody who's just, a driver commuting to work. And he's stopped constantly by cops for no reason. And I have, this blew my mind. And this is a common this is a common experience. And it's something that a lot of white people really are not privy to. They don't understand. They don't hear about this. And I've been stopped by a cop, honestly, I think once in my entire life. And it's because the sticker on my license plate was out of date. So there actually was a good reason to stop me.
Expired tabs. I just got a ticket for that recently, actually.
Exactly. But there are people of color are stopped, especially black men are stopped all the time for no reason except for, hey, why are you driving in this neighborhood?
Yeah.
Or oh, you look suspicious for some reason. Oh, you look like somebody else.
Is this your car?
Yeah, is this your car? Yeah. Do you really drive this BMW? So there is this constant discrimination, and it's not just in the police force, but it's kind of a microcosm of how society operates, how we think about race generally in society and how it really isn't addressed.
Yeah. But did you ever think, as you were hearing these things, right, for example, that black people or people of color are pulled over more frequently, was there a part of you that was like, but are they really? Or but no, no way. Why would that happen? I think that's what happens for some white people when they hear that they're like, well, that's not my experience. I don't think that actually happens.
Yeah. That's definitely the initial. So I'm not sure if I had that reaction, because once I heard those stories, I heard enough of them, it became clear this was a thing that was happening. Yeah. But yeah, I think people do have that. I should say, I think a lot of white people do have that initial response because it seems so crazy. Because it's not their worldview, and that's what really have to go back to and think about. Everything that you are considering right now, everything that you're thinking about, the feelings that you have right now to everything I'm saying is based on your upbringing, based on your perspective, based on your lived experience. So if your lived experience is of somebody who has never experienced any of these things, it may sound crazy to you, but this is why you have to open yourself up to other people's experiences. And also, don't allow phrases or terms like white fragility to close you up and hold you back. It's not about like, I mean, and if you feel that way, you're kind of proving the point.
Yeah, well,
right?
not even hearing the term white fragility, but just hearing the term white people. Like, I've gotten feedback from people that even just when I talk about white people as a generalization, that A, I'm being racist, and that B, I'm being insensitive, and that then I do call that out as like, well, that is actually a symptom of white fragility.
Yeah.
And I guess I want to get a little bit into it's a tough one to go into here.
Oh, I'm all for tough topics. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I think when discussing white fragility, when discussing just these dynamics with race, white people often feel like they are wrong or like they can't be included in the conversation and that they just have to like shut up. And I think there are times where that is the case, but for the most part, it is really important to have these conversations. And I think I particularly enjoy, I mean, the one person who speaks about white fragility the most is Robin DiAngelo, and she's actually based out of Washington and has wrote a book on this. But I think the fact that she's a white woman allows her to actually really have some of that power to influence other white people on this topic. And I'm very aware of the fact that coming from me, that this might sound slightly biased. I mean, I'm half black, half white, but regardless, I think when I'm talking about white people, people then see me as a person of color and they see me as more or less like them than they do usually, which is more like them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I have now made myself other by exploring white fragility and discussing that. So I appreciate you being a white man and talking about this, and I hope that this perhaps allows people to be a little bit more open when discussing that. But white fragility in and of itself is essentially a denial to this racism and to other people of color sharing their stories and people not being able to accept that as truth. And I'm hoping you can talk a little bit more, perhaps with some specific examples or just generally what white fragility looks like and how you recognize it.
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, that is a tough one. The thing is, a lot of this is really based on a power dynamic. Mm-hmm. So because white people are so this goes back to a lot of assumptions that white people have about why society is this way. So a lot of white people think, hey, well, white people are in positions of power at the top of these companies because they work the hardest. So that's why they. And no, I know that's hard to hear because that's what a lot of white people.
But it is so true, and it's a conversation I've had to have with people too. Of like, it's not about working hard. Like, that's not what privilege. We haven't discussed privilege yet, but privilege plays a huge part in this conversation. Where privilege is not about the fact that you work hard or you don't work hard.
Yeah, a lot of this, like a lot of the power that exists in the U.S. and in Canada, especially in the West in general, is. It's based in colonialism. So, I mean, Europeans came here to the West, and they stole land and, murder, genocide of the indigenous people of these lands, and they began a life here. These white people began a life here that has now led to where we are today, which is why all these white people are in positions of power, mostly at the top of these companies, in society, in politics, because we're talking about like hundreds of years of ingrained,
and they built that society. At which
built that
they
society
would be
around them. Yes, so this is why. Again, it always goes back to history, and I'm constantly learning about history as well. I'm no expert by any means.
Did you study history?
No, but I'm beginning to get more into it now that I cover politics. So I begin to look back at how we got to where we are.
Yeah.
And when you look back at how we got to where we are, it's clear white people designed a society around white people. So. And again, understanding that these people, these Europeans, were immigrants to this country, stole this land from indigenous people. Everybody else coming after them that may not be white but are still immigrants, just like those white people were, we're all immigrants. So unless you're indigenous to this land, you are an immigrant. So understanding that and understanding the only difference here is cultural and is how we look. That doesn't mean, or that doesn't preclude us from being able to build a society where we are all represented. And again, it's a slog, it's a struggle. We are slowly getting to that. But yeah, it's when it comes to recognizing white fragility.
Before you go into that, feel like I want to have you on for like every other episode, because I'm like, all right, we got to talk about like building walls. Like we got to talk about privilege. I'm just like, there's so many things.
That's the thing with politics. It's never ending. You can get into culture, get into politics, get into electoral politics. I mean, it's a whole thing.
Yeah.
But I, honestly, I'm not even sure how to answer that question, because it's all around us. I mean, white fragility is constant. So it's like it's hard to really. I mean, if anything, I feel like people of color can kind of give their experience or share their experiences in a way where it can enlighten people like myself who may not be as used to really, or because we grew up in the society, because I grew up in a white suburb, a lot of the fragility is just normal to me. Mm-hmm. So it's almost hard for me to really recognize it unless I'm looking for it, right?
Yeah.
So that's where sharing experiences and being open to hearing those other experiences from people that don't look like you or don't have your culture really helps to inform white people. But it comes back to, are you willing to be open and hearing those experiences? Because if you're not open to hearing those experiences, if this podcast has already made you angry,
maybe
when we haven't really got into or even tried to offend anybody, it can be it's a tough thing to really explore without hearing those experiences.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And so, for example, I shared when this huge fragility topic came up on my Instagram when I was sharing it. In part, it was around Trump saying, encouraging this "send her back" chant about Congresswoman Omar. Mm-hmm. And feeling triggered by that experience, but then also just going into discussing privilege and how when you have power, that those things. That the things that you say and the policies you advocate for and all these things, how you live your life, really impact people. That you then give permission to other people to continue that kind of language. And essentially trying to call out, just the general racism that exists. And, for example, I've done an episode on this before, talking about the question, what are you? That oftentimes as a mixed race person of color with a very ambiguous looking background, appearance, I'll get white people that come up to me on the street literally randomly and just be like, what are you? I love your curls. What are you? And, when I share experiences like that, that there is such a urge to defend the white person.
Yeah.
And that, to me, is like, well, this is a symptom of your white fragility coming in. And I get where, like, naming it that way and calling it that feels like, oh, you did something wrong, and now that's, making you feel like you're a bad person, which is not the case. But it's this urge to, like, jump in and defend the white person without actually hearing out what that person of color's experience was.
Yeah. This goes back to people thinking that your intentions is everything. So because that person that's talked to you didn't mean anything by it, that, it's okay because she just was trying to be nice. But it's like, no, you have to understand the impact of your words.
Yeah.
So even if your intention is to be kind and to start a conversation, you have to be able to understand the impact that can have. And I mean, when you look, there has to be also an awareness that a lot of people right now are just so clueless. Which is why I think it's important to be able to approach these conversations not in a way that will, have people close down and not take any information in, but be able to open them up. So, which is why I mentioned this. So even if you go in a conversation like that as a white person and you think I have good intention here, what's wrong? Sit back and take in the experience of the other person, because what you're doing is you're making the other person feel like they are other, they are different.
Yeah,
they are not a part of this society. Oh, what are you? You're not like me. What are you? Like that those words have an impact and that don't make you feel like you belong.
Yeah,
and when the rest of society is also doing that as well when it comes to the hiring process, when it comes to these power dynamics, when it comes to having mostly white men in positions of power and in politics, then it feeds into an already existing narrative that definitely has a way or has an impact on people if you aren't able to understand how those words may affect people.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I can mention briefly as well. We have this Don Cherry in Canada.
Yes, please educate us on this situation. And granted, this is happening now, which is mid-November. But I think totally to this story that there's much to learn and can be beneficial even listening after the fact.
So Don Cherry, just a quick bio. He's an NHL commentator. He's sort of like a Canadian icon. So he was a coach, back years and years ago. He became this staple of Canadian hockey. Every Saturday, Coach's Corner. Him and Ron McLean would talk about hockey. But then Don Cherry would often touch on cultural issues, or even when talking about hockey, would mention European players and French people and kind of treat them as wimps. I mean, if he didn't say it directly, which he would say it directly often, there would always be this air of like, those aren't real hockey players. The real hockey players are these good white Canadian boys, born and bred in Canada. So there was always this feeling of, or he always created this idea that hockey was about the white people. Was a sport for white Canadian men or white American men. And so recently, he said on air essentially that immigrants, I'm quoting here almost exactly. You come here, you love our milk and honey, but you don't respect the country. Essentially saying a lot of immigrants don't wear poppies. So for Remembrance Day, you don't wear poppies to represent the veterans that served us in the past, which just it's a lie completely. Like, it's not true.
But and poppies are like a flower that you guys wear.
It's a flower, that we wear. So this is not an American thing, I guess.
Nope.
Okay.
But because now I have a bunch of Canadian friends, I do see some people like with the flower.
So a poppy is like a red flower we wear on our coat or our shirt to represent veterans essentially on Remembrance Day.
And he's saying that immigrants don't do that because they don't appreciate
the country, which first of all isn't true. But even if so, I'll just out myself here. I didn't wear a poppy this year, and I'm a white guy.
How dare you?
Is Don Cherry coming after me? Yeah, exactly. This is so. All kinds of people don't wear poppies or do wear poppies. Like the whole, but the idea is basically again feeding into this narrative that you have the others, and here we are in Canada as the white people. We're doing good. We're representing Canada, but the others aren't. It's so he was eventually fired for this, which I mean, someone who's a staple in Canadian or in the NHL and hockey in Canada for years and years to be fired. People thought, or I should say, some people thought. So his defenders thought this is crazy. How could you possibly do this? For people like me and everybody else. We thought he should have been fired like 20 years ago. Like, like finally, like this is the final, like this is the straw that broke the camel's back. But so, and I'm saying this as I have close friends who I saw defending Don Cherry, and it forced me to put out a statement because I saw this and I'm like, I got to say something. I can't be silent about this. Yeah. We're essentially saying, look, I grew up loving Don Cherry. I grew up watching this guy. He was entertaining. He's always been entertaining. As somebody who, I should say, he was entertaining when I wasn't aware of the impact of much of what he was saying. So again,
tell him.
Yeah. Again, going back to the experience or how our own perspective kind of clouds our judgment. So I grew up, watching this guy, loving this guy, but eventually, as I grew and learned more about the world. And really began to understand a lot of what Don Cherry was saying was just complete BS. I mean, even to go back to sort of objective analysis, though I don't want to say just objective analysis, but something factual that he was wrong about that doesn't deal with race or culture, but gives you an idea of how often he was wrong. He fought for Canada to be in the Iraq War back in 2003. So we look back at now, even Republicans, diehard conservatives agree the Iraq War was a huge mistake. But here's Don Cherry back in the early 2000s arguing that Canada should join the Iraq War, which, again, I mean, I know it's a political issue, but it shows you how wrong he is on many of these issues. So he was wrong about that, and he's wrong about immigrants. He's wrong about culture. And it isn't about that he offends people, because that's what a lot of white people think. Oh, Don Cherry offended some people. People complained, and that's why he got fired. No.
But they don't realize like the actual impact of
they
what he
don't
said,
realize-
being like, wait, no,
No.
this was actually something that there should have been some kind of consequence for.
Yeah,
And that was harmful.
This was a guy who for years was misinforming people, was for years talking to his largely white male audience and keeping them closed into this worldview that just wasn't real, that was just completely made up.
Yeah.
So that is the actual cultural impact. You have somebody in a position of power on television every week, often talking about these issues, knowing nothing at all about what he's talking about, clearly impacting millions of people. A lot of kids watch Coach's Corner, watch hockey, obviously, on the weekend, and they're being impacted by his words. And that's the issue here. It's not that Don Cherry offended people. It's that he created this narrative that was never true. And he negatively impacted our culture because of it. So that is why he was let go. And that goes to people not understanding the impact of their words and of white fragility and of power dynamics as well. So because he was in that position of power, that's why he had to be pushed out. So, yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that it's making me think of so many things in American politics where like just that premise, itself, has played out a lot within American politics. One thing I want to get to that you spoke about that I think a lot of people are struggling with these days, with more, I think it's as we become more and more educated on things, but also as we just have more access to more stories, that you have friends that potentially have different points of view than you do, and coming to terms with that and trying to navigate that. How do you handle that, like mentally and emotionally, being friends with, or no longer being friends with, I don't know, people that you find then aren't advocating for people of color, or are not practicing being allies for people of color, or, perpetuating things like racism or sexism or whatever? Like, how have you managed that personally?
So luckily in my experience, I've been able to be a voice where they've been willing to listen to me. Yeah. So because I look like them, so I'm talking about white people here.
You have an advantage.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I have an advantage in...
This is a part of privilege.
Yes, exactly. I have the privilege of being able to educate other white people who don't know what the hell they're talking about. So that gives me the advantage there. So I've never been in luckily, I mean, I grew up in a fairly open-minded, progressive home, even though I grew up in a very, white suburb. But my family was very open-minded in that sense. And my friends for the most part as well. But yeah, I've never had any family member or friend just be completely shut off to listening to me. So if it's ever gotten to that, or if it ever had to get to that, I'm not sure how I'd be friends with someone like that. Just because if I can't... if somebody's not willing to understand or listen and understand that their impact, that they can have a negative impact on other people through their words or how they carry themselves, then it's really hard to, I think, have a relationship with that person. But for the most part, I've been able to luckily get through to people like that. I haven't talked to the people I'm talking about right now or thinking about right now when it comes to the Don Cherry thing. I will definitely have conversations with them about. I'm sure it'll come up. So I'm actually looking forward to those conversations because I'm curious what their thoughts are or how they, I should say, how they express their views on this. But yeah, it's part of it is listening. So even me as somebody who I would say is largely a little more educated on these issues than most white people are, I think it's important for me to listen as well, because if it's just a one-way conversation, you're really I'm not going to get through to that person. So I have to hear what their experience is and also speak from experience. So speak from, or speak in this way, say, hey, I understand what you're saying. I understand you think this way based on this, and this, but here's why I think what I think. And then, and so it's not just about telling people that they're wrong. It's about explaining to them why you think what you think. So I can go back, I can bring up history lessons or bring up this and that, bring up different examples to really drive home why I feel how I feel. And it's not just about, I was offended or I was bothered by this, but it's actually rooted in something that is real, that people can actually hear and think, okay, I didn't know about that part of our history. Now I understand this a little better. And that's how you begin to really, I think, get through to people on these issues.
That makes sense. And I think it's nice to have that addition education and knowledge around these subjects going into the conversation, in addition to just having that privilege that you don't have to necessarily work for any kind of respect or credibility to discuss these topics.
I should say as well, too, if you're someone who's white who understands this, it's kind of on us. It's on you to help educate other people in your life, your friends and family, because like you're saying, it is harder for someone like you to get through to people who are going to be closed off. So if you know people in your life, definitely get through to them.
Yeah, and in addition to that, like the two-way street thing that you were just talking about, in terms of the communication, I think a piece that I often have to fight against or communicate when I do have these conversations, largely on Instagram, with mainly white women, is that a piece I don't think people understand is that people of color have to put in so much emotional energy and emotional labor to discussing these things when they attempt to educate other white people or non-people of color on their experiences, and that sometimes that leads to me not having the energy to be able to have a two-way conversation to where it's I sometimes I don't have the empathy for you to listen to what your experience has been, because I'm exhausted now at not only trying to help you understand my story, but also then having to defend myself and why that's even valid. Yeah.
That's also why we cannot put this on people of color to do this work, because it's not fair to put that all on you. And I mean, this reminds me of another example. We have a leader, a political leader here, Jagmeet Singh of the NDP. He's a Sikh man. He wears a turban. And during his campaign, a man walked up to him, and he was like an older man and was acting kind, but said, "Cut your turban off. You look like a Canadian."
I did hear about this. Yes.
And so the way Jagmeet Singh reacted, because he's a political leader, he acted very kindly. He said, "No, sir."
PC.
Yeah, very PC. He said, "No, sir, this is Canada. You can wear what you want, do what you want." He's like, "Oh, in Rome, do what the Romans do." He's like, "No, this is Canada." And then kind of, he was Jagmeet Singh was very kind, walked off, but he was clear. So I actually recently saw an interview with him, and he was clear where he was saying, "This is me. This is my me as someone who's leading a political party. This is how I feel I should deal with this situation, because I feel like I can get through people better this way as someone who's leading a party." But he was clear he made clear, he doesn't expect everyone else to act that way.
Yeah.
If you just said F off, then that's a perfectly fine, reaction. That's almost that should be your reaction, because you shouldn't be expected to have to always explain yourself. And I think that's what white people need to understand as well. We can't always expect people of color to have to explain themselves to us, because we should already know these things. We should already be doing our own work to understand how we should be inclusive, how we should actually understand the experiences of other people. Yes. And we don't do the work. A lot of us do not do the work. And look, we all have busy lives. I get it. But when it comes to social interactions, these are everyday things. People in your office, people you work with. It's important to understand how to talk to other people who don't have your perspective. Yeah. So it's on us to do the work, do the research. And if you already know this stuff, it's on you to now help inform other people in society who do not know these things.
This whole podcast is just a PSA. I just want to take every clip of your responses and be like, PSA. Wonderful. This specific situation, I love how he did handle it, and I think that dynamic is what people are expecting and what they almost demand that people of color deliver. That when I'm sharing something and someone responds with something racist and I have to explain how that was racist, that I should be doing it in this very respectful, zero sass, and I understand, trust me, I understand. I'm a therapist. I get how to communicate with people. But when I'm subjective, right, and when I'm personally involved and I have emotion, right, I have passion behind this, it is not always going to come out in this pretty tidy little bow. And guess what? That is also the privilege of white people, is that they don't even have to have that energy to force themselves, right, to deliver these things, right? Like, people of color are not expecting that, like, white people are going to be tidying everything up with a little bow, like, to protect our feelings. Like, we're used to being insulted in some way or offended in some way. And then when we actually share that we are, it's not like they're like, oh, like, I'm really sorry about that. And that is where white fragility comes in.
They get offended because you spoke up and gave your experience. And it's just,
exactly. I have to emotionally caretake for your hurt feelings over my experience. And I'm very thankful because I do have many followers that are like very woke, right? And like educate themselves on this and appreciate the fact that I have these conversations and try to also help me learn when I am having them, which I super appreciate. And I've gotten many comments because I do try to have a two-way conversation, right? And I try to educate and acknowledge where it is difficult for some of these white women that I'm talking with. But then I'm super thankful because I'll get the messages that are like, no, like, you don't have to apologize for the fact that, you know, you had a little bit of sass in that. Like, that's tone policing. Yeah. Like, they're literally tone policing you right now. And I'm like, oh yeah, shit. Like, you're right. Like, I'm trying to like deliver it in this pretty bow.
What's funny though, but in their mind, they think that, oh, you're being so PC. When it's like, it's like, what do you, the person that said what got you to react that way, like, they have to understand the impact of those words, and now they're being offended. They're the ones that are actually being PC or being I guess fragile. Because they can't take your perspective. They can't take someone else delivering their experience. But you know, a lot of it as well is I think people are just, we close down, and I mean, people in general, when we're attacked, we kind of we have this inclination to defend, to just kind of hunker down and defend and protect our ego, protect our feelings.
But just the fact that saying that, like, you have an experience with a white person and are generalizing and saying, like, yeah, this is something I experienced with white people, that's not an attack. But that's the fragility coming in, where people feel attacked. And then they react out of that. And that's when it's like, just this shit show.
It's definitely it's a delicate balance. I mean, it's tough because there's no reason for people of color to have to police their feelings when they're. I mean, when do we ever police white people when they react? Like it's become like. Like, it's a normal thing to see a white lady yelling at a cashier, like, but if the roles are reversed or it's you know, the angry black man or angry black woman, like, that becomes a thing, and it's so absurd because there's this, again, it goes back to this worldview of that many white people have of these are white nations, but people don't even, like, a lot of white people don't even really register that. They don't recognize that's how they think. They just think, oh, this is normal. Like, this is kind of this is standard, basically. Like, the way society is right now with the white people in charge, this is just standard. So any change to that is actually impacting my freedom as a white person, because no longer do we have all these positions of power. Like, it's like,
what are we gonna do?
But like, and so for them, you're attacking their equality because their equality is we have all the power, but that was never equal. So there's just a total disconnect and not understanding that what we have right now is a complete hold on society, and that becoming a little more equal is not taking away our freedom. It's treating society as it should be. Equality
only feels like oppression when you've had privilege.
Yes, that's the perfect way to put it.
PSA. Yes. Speaking of white people in power, let's touch on feeling the burn.
Yes.
Because I've shared Bernie on my Instagram. It is no secret. I support Bern. I love Bern. I really am hoping that Bernie is elected our next election. I have not talked about it a ton on the podcast. I certainly still welcome people that have different points of view, obviously, as I would hope all of you listeners know. And I don't want you to think that because I'm supporting this specific political candidate that means that we can never be friends, right? Or that I'm going to think you're a terrible person. I don't think that's the case. But I do think it's important to do your research on your candidates and to make a decision. Find someone that you're going to advocate for, that you want to be a part of their team, and run with that. Like, get involved with that person. I've donated to Bernie's campaign a few times. I plan on participating and some door knocking when I get back to Seattle.
Nice.
And I've never done that before, like in high school, I guess, but not like for a political candidate. But it's important to get involved in that. And so it's okay if it's not Bernie Sanders for you. For me, it is. And I highly encourage all of you to, again, just do your research and figure that out. But again, to this question that we mentioned in the beginning that AOC recently answered, and that I'm sure maybe some of you would have for me, about why we should elect a old white man to power.
So this goes back to people not being able to separate identity and actual politics and material changes in people's lives. So when we look back, let's just go back to 2016 for a minute here.
Do we have to?
I know we got to open some old wounds here, but so back in 2016, you had two candidates, essentially, in the Democratic primary, Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton. Now, there was, from the very beginning, Bernie Sanders was kind of sidelined, especially by the mainstream press.
Yeah, he's crazy.
Yeah, he's crazy old Bernie. What is this guy doing? He's going to have no support. Yeah. He closed a 60-point gap to Hillary Clinton. And people at the time, people in media thought, oh, it's just because he's the alternative to Hillary Clinton. He's a white male. People don't like that Hillary's a woman. But when you actually dive into their politics, Bernie actually spoke for the poor and middle class. He has a 40-year track record, of fighting for the same thing, fighting for universal health care, fighting for higher wages. He held one of the first gay pride parades as mayor of Burlington, Vermont in 1983. Yeah. He fought for gay rights on the House in Congress in the 90s.
Mass incarceration.
Yeah, mass incarceration. He fought for civil rights. He, as a 20-year-old, he chained himself to a black woman to protest housing segregation. So this is a man who has a deep history, both in social movements, in economic movements, in supporting mass movements of people to change how society should be run. Yeah. So you look back at these two candidates, and Hillary Clinton was essentially the perfect establishment-friendly candidate, meaning that she protected those already in power. She protected the wealthy. She protected essentially the way society already was. And she wasn't challenging it. She didn't have big ideas like Medicare for all, for example, that Bernie was supporting. And there really was a major difference between these two candidates. And even and look, once he lost the primary and she won, he worked his butt off to support her. Yep. He went state to state to state. I have a video. If people, there's so much misinformation about, once Bernie lost, he didn't even help her. Complete
he did
lie.
So many campaign
There's an
trails
MSNBC segment from Rachel Maddow, who I'm not the biggest fan of anymore. For her politics have changed a lot over the past 10 years. But she did a video did a segment on Bernie Sanders going state to state to state to state, supporting Hillary Clinton. Nobody worked harder for Hillary Clinton than Bernie Sanders did. Yeah. But so just going back to now, though, the reason to support Bernie Sanders is not because he's a white man or anything like that. You have to look at who endorses him. So you hit Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Nina Turner, Killer Mike. He has a very diverse support base, and it's because he actually has a track record, a 40-year track record. But not only that, he has built this movement. So he began to build this movement in 2016. And now he has the biggest grassroots movement by far out of any candidate in the race. Yeah. He has the most volunteers by far, the most individual donors by far, the most individual donations by far, the most money by far, but just from individual donors, takes no corporate money, no PAC money. He only fights for the people. Yeah. And he has a strategy so he doesn't just have the best agenda. So we can go over, canceling student debt, Medicare for all. Go down the list. He's the most progressive candidate on every single issue. But it isn't just about that. It's about how he will fight and actually get his agenda passed. And it's through his movement. So he will activate. So no other president has done this in my lifetime and definitely in recent memory, where he has a plan to be the organizer in chief. So he, as president, will activate movements across the country to put pressure on their politicians to support the agenda that he wants to get passed for the American people. So say West Virginia, you have a very conservative senator there, Joe Manchin. He won't support Medicare for all. Bernie's Medicare for All plan, even though he's a Democrat. But Bernie will go there, rally voters there to put pressure on Joe Manchin to support Medicare for All. And if Joe Manchin still doesn't support it, Bernie will support a primary challenger to Joe Manchin to push Joe Manchin out and get somebody in there who will support his agenda. So Bernie has that strategy. Because he's a lifelong independent, he's not attached to any party. He's attached to the people. So when you have a president that actually is going to fight for the people and not do what Barack Obama did, which he ran a very progressive campaign in 2008 and then made way too many compromises once he actually became president, abandoned a lot of what he fought for, abandoned the movement that he built. I mean, Obama built a huge movement in 2008 and just sort of let them go. Bernie's not going to do that. Bernie's going to fight for his agenda and to fight to actually help people. And if you don't believe me, look at who's supporting him. The people with the most energy behind them right now: Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib. These massive congresswomen, they've been fantastic since joining Congress, and they're actually fighting for you.
Yeah, and AOC actually was like a volunteer on the campaign trail for Bernie in
2016.
Yeah, and that's part of what like got her really motivated to want to be in politics as well. So yeah, I mean, everything you said, I echo.
You can tell I'm kind of passionate about Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, like politics, I knew this wasn't going to be an issue to like get you to talk on this. And I think, I think many people feel some kind of pressure to be able to talk about politics perfectly. And partially that's why I appreciate the fact that you said all of those things, because I know I don't say it perfectly. But I think it's okay to, be a little uncertain when you do discuss some of the nuances of politics, right? Like, it's okay to admit that you don't know some things. It's okay to be, unsure perhaps on some policies, but I think it's just important to have the conversations, right? And for me, Bernie is someone who is actually going to fight really hard for people that look like me, for people that can't advocate for themselves, and that I won't feel offended by him, right? Like, I don't, and it's not to say that emotions do play a part, okay? Like, people vote emotionally, for sure. There's certainly the, like, you need to educate yourself and, based on that too, but a lot of it is also emotional. And one of the things that I do love about Bernie is that he's got a lot of sass, and like he doesn't hold back on that, and that he you can hear it in his voice when he's talking about shit that he is for it, and he is going to advocate for that, and it is not just like because someone's paying him to or because he thinks this is what's going to get him elected. But that it's shit that he can literally back up that he's been doing for years and years and years.
For him, it's a lifelong fight. And there really is no candidate in my lifetime that had, and I'm talking Canada or America. There's no one in Canada that's like him either. Like this is why I've discussed before, he's a once in a lifetime candidate. It is so rare to have somebody who is an activist run for president and build a movement like this. You have to understand when you have a win, I mean, this is the guy that will absolutely help to deliver. And again, he talks about his campaign slogan is not me, us.
Yes.
Which tells you everything you need to know, because he is clear that he will not be able to get this agenda passed himself.
Yeah,
that it's about the movement.
And that it's not about him of just like his goal of wanting to be president. And that's what
which he never even had. Like, if he had the goal to be president, he would have ran a lot earlier than when he was in the 70s. Yeah. So he's never really cared he's never really cared to have power. So it's not about that at all. It's actually about the people.
Yeah. And that is what I hear from like some of the candidates, right? Where I feel like it's just like they just really want to be president, and they think that they can do the best job.
They want the status. They want that's all it is.
Yeah, and that's not for me. Amazing political convo. Super appreciate it. I'm glad we talked about Bernie. I have not talked about Bernie on the podcast. If people want to hear you talk more, which I hope they do because I super enjoy hearing you talk about this, and love all the history that you share on it, and think that piece is also super important. Where could people follow you, find you, watch you, stalk you? You're also very attractive, but you do have a girlfriend, so sorry, he's not available. Already checked. But he's super great. So where can people find you?
So my YouTube channel is at therationalnational.com. So that'll get you to the YouTube channel. And on Twitter, just at David Doel, DavidDoel, all one word. And same for Instagram as well. And that's it.
Amazing. I hope you guys check them out. This has been fantastic. Thank you so much.
I love this. Thank you for having me.
Discussing all the things.
No problem. Anytime.
Thank you. All right, that does it for today's episode. Thank you so much for making it all the way through and keeping your ears, your hearts, and your minds open. It would mean so much to me if you could take a second or two after listening to this episode to leave a review on iTunes and let me know what you're enjoying about the show. I love reading, what your favorite episodes are, where you guys listen, and definitely feel free to share this with a friend. I mean, part of how we break down the stigmas around these topics is by talking about them, right? And sharing them with more people. So definitely share the podcast. And again, really wanting to include all of you in this podcast. So if you have questions or you want to share a thought or an experience, please send in a voice memo to ask.letstalkaboutit@gmail.com. And I'm really excited to keep having these conversations and breaking down these stigmas. So thank you all so much. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week, and I'll talk to you next time.